Well, welcome everybody, those present and those looking in electronically. It is a huge privilege and pleasure to welcome our most distinguished speaker today, both Federal Union and the Federal Trust. We couldn't have a better speaker from the true North, strong and free, than Mr. Charest. Jean Charest is a Canadian with both French and Irish heritage. He was admitted to the Bar of Quebec before election to the Canadian Parliament as a Conservative, and still in his 20s, becoming the youngest person to serve in a Canadian cabinet. Amongst other responsibilities, he was member of the Minister of the Environment, attending Canada's delegation to the Rio Summit. He became Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Industry and Science. And what may be particularly topical in this country after the general election, he was one of only 2 Conservative MPs elected in 1993, and then became the first French Canadian to lead his party. Having rebuilt the party, always one for a challenge, in 1998, he became leader of the Quebec Liberal Party and then Premier of Quebec with an agenda of economic reform. He became the first premier to win 3 successive elections. In 2009, he became a commander of the Légion d'honneur, and more recently, he joined the supervisory board of Publicis Group and is a partner of the Montreal law practice Terrien Coutu Jolicoeur. With wisdom, it was so tragically to choose to lack in Ireland, and indeed the rest of the UK, the British Parliament prepared the way for Canada's Constitution Act of 1867. This set out a charter of rights and division of responsibility between federal and provincial levels of government. Mr. Charest, please tell us more of what we Brits are missing.
Thank you very, very much. And I want to thank both Dirk Hazel and Brendan Donnelly for inviting me at the Federal Trust and the Federal Union. I hope that you can hear me well. The sound is coming in well. Good, because we are on the other side of the ocean, and I'm delighted to join you and to be able to share some thoughts about federalism, to share our experience, to tell you a bit of our story and how it may or may not apply to those who think that this is a form of government, of organization that should be explored, both within the UK, but also with the European Union. And all of this is very topical. You know, we're at the north of the United States, and we are bombarded every day with American politics, and it's a very interesting experience to watch how democracy in that country is being called into question. And actually, I was on a panel earlier this morning with one of our ex-US ambassadors in Canada. It was quite alarming about what was happening. I guess the point I just wanted to make as I open my remarks is that there seems to be at this time a whole host of things that we've taken for granted, that we thought would be there forever. And it's worth stopping to think about what we have built, what we've done, what our experience is, and what our options are in the future, because there doesn't seem to be anything of what we're doing that we can take for granted as being permanent, either politically or otherwise. I want to start by, I want to talk about how Canadian federalism works, but to do that requires that we do a bit of history. Our Constitution was delivered in 1867 by the House of Commons in Great Britain, so it's almost 160 years old. It was preceded by some very intense debates on the future of the colonies here. And in the backdrop of that, keep in mind, and this is true today and it'll be true for the future, that we always have this American neighbor that's very present and omnipresent in any debate in Canada. And whatever happens in the United States obviously has a great deal of impact on the way we see ourselves and how we're organized. Now, 1867 is in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and of course the Revolution in the United States. 1867, and the American Constitution, as you know, came to be in 1787, and the French Revolution in 1789. So all of these events coalesce around the choices that are going to be made by political leaders almost 160 years ago. If we return back in history, the British North America came to be after la guerre de Cent Ans, the 100-Year War, and the Traité de Versailles of 1764. And at that time, the French government decided to cede the lands of British North America, of their colonies in North America, in exchange for other parts of the world that they felt more strongly about. A great mistake at the time, but there was on that territory at the time 60,000 French-speaking individuals who lived in this part of North America. What happened afterwards, and I'm sorry to be so short in general, is that the British officials realized very rapidly that it would be difficult for them to convince people to move to that part of the world, that if they were going to have some authority and some ability of control over that land, especially with was happening at the South in the United States, that they would have to make some compromises. Something very significant happened in 1774 called the Act of Quebec. And at that time, the British authorities chose to recognize the Catholic religion, to dispense those who were of French Catholic faith of doing an oath of loyalty to the crown, and they recognized French civil law. Why is this important? Well, it is important because at the very incept of Canada, the very moment Canada is being created, there is this recognition of differences, and it is legitimated in this piece of legislation that is going to be a foundational and very significant for the future of what will become Canada and its federal system of government. Through the ensuing period, there's a creation of Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Ontario, Quebec, the colony of New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and discussions on how these provinces can work together and coalesce into one single government. At the center of it all, interestingly enough, is a very strong preoccupation about trade. In fact, a good deal of the narrative around the creation of Canada is about 4 provinces coming together to create a trade agreement, and to counterbalance, of course, the protectionist attitudes of our American neighbor, which hasn't changed a great deal, you'll say. It's still there. But this was a great deal and a good part of the narrative. There was a very real debate on what form of government we would have, whether it be a centralized form of government or a decentralized. And the whole nexus of the debate, there was a conference in 1864, was around that. Our first prime minister in Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, who was a conservative, wanted a centralized form of government. But he realized at the time that that would be impossible to do if there was not an accommodation of some of the differences, one of them being the recognition and giving legislative powers, key legislative powers, to what was Lower Canada at the time, the province of Quebec. And if there were no compromise in that direction, there would be no country. Thus, the genesis, thus the core of what explains why we are in a federal system as opposed to a centralized. At the very heart of the creation of the country is a willingness to recognize differences and to give French-speaking people at the time, majority of them being Catholic, and it was very much defined in religious terms, powers over their key legislative powers in areas of jurisdiction that were important for their future. And thus the decision to create a federal system of government. The other factor that weighs heavily is the extreme and the very important landmass that we are dealing with. So geographically, we're also dealing with an extraordinary piece of real estate here. It's not yet, the Western provinces are not yet created at the time, but they're obviously on the radar screen of those who are creating our federal system of government. And so the decision is made to create a federal system of government. and attribute powers to each level. The federal government in Section 91 of the Constitution is given powers over foreign policy, over the creation of what is the Bank of Canada, national defense, the borders, and doing tariffs. The provinces are allocated powers in the area of education, healthcare, civil law, and thus has created one of the most decentralized federations in the world. One of the interesting attributes of the Canadian federal system is that the jurisdiction over natural resources is allocated to the provinces, which is an exception to the rule where there are federal governments, or obviously unitary governments, who usually reserve their control over natural resources given their critical importance, both economically and strategically for a country, but not in Canada. It's the provinces who control natural resources, which will have a very substantive and material effect on the development of the country and of these economic sectors. And so there is this distribution of power. And in fact, Canada back then, but also today, is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. I always, and I hope I'm not offend anyone by just remarking that the only other federation I know of more decentralized than Canada is Belgium. And no one knows how Belgium works. And so Canada is very decentralized. In fact, if you look at it another way, and I had the privilege of doing half of my political active life in the federal government, half in the provincial government. The federal government in Canada is like a holding company, if you look at it in modern times. They transfer resources to the provinces through equalization agreements, a healthcare agreement, through an agreement on social, and they transfer money to individuals through old age pensions, for example. The provinces run the country on a day-to-day basis. Canada is a country that is run by the provinces: education, healthcare, the roads, civil law. So on a day-to-day basis, the heavy lifting of governing in Canada is done by the provinces. And the federal government is like this holding company. What is particular, though, after the attribution of powers, is that the federal government have certain other powers that they use that allow arbitration of what would be unforeseen jurisdictions or circumstances. And one extremely important power the federal government has is its spending power, which is not described in the Constitution, but is a conventional constitutional convention. What is the spending power? It says that the federal government can, if it wishes to, spend in areas of provincial jurisdiction, thus crossing the line of what the initial deal was, by the simple virtue that they have the money to spend in that area. Now, the provinces don't always have to accept, or not necessarily accept, to do an agreement with them in that respect, but they have the power to do that. This power was used more and more as time went on. What happened after the First World War, for example, the federal government did not have any powers to do personal taxation. The provinces, for the sake of prosecuting the war, accepted to give the federal government powers of taxation, which the federal government said that would be temporary. And well, guess what? I mean, I'm sure you're all going to be shocked to learn that a temporary taxation measure became permanent, and so a very typical outcome of that. And then, as the Second World War reared its head, Canada entered into a industrial production agreement with the United States. The federal government took up more powers yet, and thus developed what was going to become the modern Canadian state. The development of healthcare, for example, which it used its spending power to finance a national healthcare system based, by the way, on the model of Great Britain, of your NHS. And I'm sorry to report that I don't think our system is working very well. And I don't want to judge the performance of your own NHS, but
That's very tactful of you. Very tactful of you.
Well, I don't need to make any more enemies. I've done plenty of, but our NHS, interestingly enough, is modeled on the Great Britain model, but this is a provincial jurisdiction. A very good example of how our system works. The federal government says, "I'm going to do national legislation that imposes conditions on how I transfer my money. If you want my money, you don't have to take it. But if you take it, here is a few basic rules. It has to be universal. There can be no private sector delivery. It's a universal public delivery, single payer, etc." So, so thus our system of federalism developed this way. There's different schools of how federalism works, but in Quebec, where there's a very strong, still a strong separatist movement, but a sentiment of autonomy, of provinces having to assume their autonomy in their areas of jurisdiction. The sense is, and the argument has always been, that both governments, that the provincial governments are not subordinate governments to the federal government. This is not a lower level of government. This is not a subnational level of government, that they are equal in their areas of jurisdiction. And sovereign, the word sovereign, in their areas of jurisdiction, not sovereign in the sense of a sovereign state, but sovereign in the sense of having total control of what responsibilities have been attributed to them. One of the key questions, both of you raised this in the preparatory call, was, well, how do you finance all of this? Because you're going to very rapidly hit that issue of who pays for what, and how do they pay for it, and how do you share that allocation of responsibility? Well, in our system, interestingly enough, this is a pretty wide open field. There are no limits to how much the provinces can tax, and the federal government has no limits either. So, but through arrangements, we determine how much and what share of provincial income tax, personal income tax we would take, or of a sales tax. There's a provincial sales tax and there's a federal sales tax, federal personal income tax, provincial personal income tax. Some provinces, Quebec runs its own Department of Revenue. The other provinces do not. It's the federal government that runs it, but then returns their share of the money. The point I want to make is this: from a fiscal point of view, the provinces have very, very real autonomy to do whatever they want. Why is this important? Well, obviously, if you're going to assume a certain number of responsibilities, you need the financial ability to fund whatever those activities are. Huge question in any jurisdiction like Great Britain, for example, where you have a fairly centralized form of government. If you were to enter into any project to decentralize, then very rapidly you're going to run up against the issue of who pays for what and who has the power to tax and then dispense. And then you're going to run into the same thinking in Whitehall that I had in my Department of Finance provincially in Quebec or in Ottawa. There's not one of those officials or departments that wants to let go of an iota or an inch of taxing power. Not one of them, for any reason. I mean, it's just, into the DNA. So these are difficult and that require very strong vision and a very strong will to be able to manage these issues. But in Canada, that's the lay of the land, and I dare to say that it's working fairly well. Back to a bit of history, just to remind you again, the American Revolution, the relationship with the United States weighs heavily in the choices that we are called upon to make. The capital and London is less and less interested in funding what is happening in the colonies that cost them a lot of money. There is that delicate and pressure to be able to create our own country and to assume our responsibilities with responsible government. And thus our federalism evolved. We had a few attempts to amend our constitution. One of the key issues was that since this was a piece of legislation that came from the House of Commons in London, we did not have the ability to amend our own constitution. So we had a series of very intense constitutional debates in the 1960s, 1970s, early 80s. that were interspersed with a referendum on the separation of Quebec in 1980, which failed in a decisive way, 60-40. And in the aftermath, the Trudeau government, Trudeau father, repatriated the Constitution, put into that Constitution a Canadian Charter of Rights that thus become constitutionalized. And then Quebec refused to sign it at the time. They felt that this was not, they had not been properly consulted, and it wasn't to their liking in terms of distribution of powers. And so followed another period where a new round of constitutional negotiations followed, on which I was very involved, called the Meech Lake Accord, which had 6 different proposals, amendments to try to bring Quebec back into the fold. It failed for all sorts of reasons. I won't go into the details of that, but it created a great deal of political heartburn in Quebec in particular. It inflamed separatist sentiment. There was a referendum in 1995, and in 1995, in that referendum in Quebec, it was a very intense and trying experience. I was on the front lines of that. 94% of eligible voters in that referendum voted. 94%. The outcome, the difference between those who voted for or against staying in Canada and the vote was in favor of staying in Canada was at 0.5% difference. You had the Brexit experience, we had that experience. And as you've learned through Brexit, I think, and we learned then, this is a very emotional debates. They're not always very rational. And I think that people look at that, they are easily hijacked by a number of issues. Governments end up being sanctioned. The referendum itself is not necessarily a straightforward proposal and a rational debate. And that was our experience. I mention that because we thus entered into a period where it was quite clear that amending the Constitution would be very risky and difficult to do without creating and putting the country at risk. But federalism, and the point I want to make, are federal systems outside of the constitutional devolution or sharing of power and those rules, has a whole other space of cooperation that governments can develop together. And that's the beauty of federalism. It's its flexibility and its ability of having governments conclude arrangements that are not of constitutional nature, may not have the same force, but do allow governments to accomplish very real things in a timely fashion and in a very effective way. So these governments, and what we've seen is government make arrangements. In 2003, I'm elected federally. I'm elected in Quebec as Premier of Quebec. This was my first government. We had long thought of how we would deal with our intergovernmental relations. We proposed the creation of what we call the Council of the Federation. This is non-constitutional. What is the Council? It was a meeting. It still exists to this day. It's over 20 years old. It structured the relationship of the provinces and the territories, because we have 10 provinces, 3 territories, into a unit that was much more cohesive in terms of working together on interprovincial relations, but also in dealing with the federal government. At a subsequent meeting in 2004, the council met with the federal government to renegotiate an agreement on healthcare. Well, in that agreement, the federal government wanted to impose conditions on the provinces to transfer more money. Quebec, and that was my government, said no. We are totally autonomous in our area of healthcare. We will not accept that the federal government impose any conditions. You transfer the money, we will allocate and arbitrate where the funds go. And they agreed, but they also agreed to a principle that was new, not constitutionalized, of the principle of asymmetrical federalism. We wanted that recognized. And so we signed a document, non-constitutional, and all the provinces, the premiers, and the leaders of the territories signed the same document saying we recognize the principle of asymmetrical federalism, which in our view was extremely important if we are going to recognize the specific needs of Quebec. So let me just return to the logic behind this. Now, there is a basic logic that applies in any given country. There's usually 3 levels of government in any, whether it's a centralized, decentralized, Republican, British parliamentary system. A national level that deals with issues of clearly of national nature. armed forces, borders, foreign policy. And then a mid-level of government, in our case, it would be the provinces that deal with issues that are closer to people, education, in our case, healthcare, civil laws, the roads, transport, and then the local level of municipalities. That's the basic logic upon which any government structure or arrangement is made. In the case of the federalism, it is formalized, decentralized. It has some features that may be linguistic. It may be a group of people. In our case, it was very much about the French language and culture in Quebec, and Francophones wanting to protect their culture and language, protecting their school systems that are associated with their language and culture, and having control and total control, and not ceding that control to a majority outside of Quebec. Some of it may be geographic. All these things are done quite deliberately with the view of protecting and allowing local authorities or local communities to control issues over which they feel they need to have a basic control if they're going to have the communities that they want. And so that was part of the thinking of our Canadian federal system. I would venture to say in conclusion that it's worked fairly well. I mean, you're going to hear a lot of complaints about it everywhere, and there's constant discussion, but that's part of government. It's part of the day-to-day government. There will always be tensions between the federal and provincial governments. We shouldn't get too carried away with that. With time, we usually have found the right solution and have moved on. But the bigger question is, for Canada, as we look into the future, a federal system now I don't think is being used very appropriately, not creative enough, and there's not enough cooperation between both levels of government. We're having intense debates on immigration and who should be doing what and who's imposing on the other level of government constraints they don't need. But, or on the management of natural resources, on carbon taxes, on the regulations for the environment, whether the federal government is overreaching in what they're doing. We have all those debates right now, but frankly, in any given country, you would have those debates. In our federal system, we have them. But the bigger question is, how do you create a sense in Canada of unity, of common vision, common cause, of a common experience? That's the biggest challenge of Canada. And right now, we're not in a very good place because the regional forces in Canada seem to be pulling us in different directions. And I'm among those who are worried for the future of the country if we don't change course and have more of an effort so that we develop our common values and speak more about what we as a country are able to accomplish together. I'll stop there, gentlemen, and Madame and Monsieur, and I'd be very happy to entertain questions or thoughts or on our federalism and how it may apply in your part of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was a tour de force, and I think you have illustrated very effectively what we Brits are missing. Brendan, you are going to ask the first question, I think.
Can I ask more than one question? One or two reflections, which inspired in me by what I thought was if I may say so, a quite remarkable presentation, a combination of such experience and knowledge and high level of abstraction, and yet very accessible. I thought that was remarkable. Thank you very much indeed. Two basic levels of reflection, if I may. One about federalism being built into the DNA of the country from the beginning. I should have known more about that, but I was reminded that it is something that was there from the beginning because of the necessity to bring together disparate strands in Canada. A question comes up, I suppose, is it possible for a centralized state to become a federal state? Might it be that there are certain states which have centralism in their DNA because that's the sort of states they are? A question, if you could talk about that. And that, of course, ties into the question of national identity. Do you think that federalism, that the federal model for Canada helps or hinders the maintenance of national identity. When people think about a federal United Kingdom, sometimes they think that that might be inimical to the British identity. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that. And then the final question is perhaps to ask about something that is very central to federalism in your neighbor in America, which is in the United States of America. At what level should such moral questions as abortion, social stroke moral questions, be decided? Should it be a provincial, or should it be a national issue? Could you comment on that and what you see as being the importance of that for federalism? Because, as you know, in the United States of America, this is very much, in addition to being a morally sensitive and controversial question, also very much a question of American federalism. So those are three topics, if I may, that I'd be absolutely fascinated to hear your thoughts on.
And there's a lot to chew off there. You may be interested, Brendan. This morning I was on a panel with a gentleman named Bruce Heyman, who was Mr. Obama's ambassador to Canada from the United States, who in his presentation said something that was very striking and very surprising to the room of Canadians. His view was that in the United States, if the presidency is won by Mr. Trump and it's a Republican Senate and a Republican House, that they will disallow abortion in the United States. I mean, that was it was quite the statement. I mean, thinking of how far we've come. And Roe versus Wade's a very interesting story, and I'll relate it to Canada. In Roe versus Wade, conservatives always thought that the Supreme Court of the United States had overreached its jurisdiction by saying we can, at the federal level, as you point out on this moral question, we have the power to regulate this. What did the American Supreme Court do in Roe versus Wade? What is it that they reversed? Essentially, to simplify, what they reversed is that they said that was a mistake. It's these individual states that have the power to determine the laws on abortion. That's what they said. That's what they changed. Now, criminal law, penal law in the United States is a provincial jurisdiction, interestingly enough. In Canada, it's a federal jurisdiction. It's the federal government that determines criminal law and who has jurisdiction over the criminal code. And I was in the federal government of Mr. Mulroney when the Supreme Court of Canada disallowed the sections of the Canadian criminal code on abortion. And this was in the early 90s, and they said these sections that disallow abortion are illegal, and created a legal emptiness or a legal vacuum, and on which we tried to legislate by trying to figure out, is it first, second, third, and finally we voted a piece of legislation in the House of Commons, and the Canadian Senate disallowed it, and we left it as is. So in Canada, there is no legislation on abortion. It's just, and the provinces go about it, and it's generally accepted that abortion. Now, on that question, you can see, so I'm trying to answer your question through the example to tell you that on some of these issues, it is the federal government that will decide. In this country, it would be the federal government on abortion. And then in the states, it would be the American states, because they control the criminal code. So, and on other moral issues, it really depends. Let's say LGBTQ issues and issues of transitioning and conversion, it's mostly provincial jurisdictions because they run the healthcare systems.
And on euthanasia, end of life, euthanasia?
Provincial, both levels of government. Interesting. My government was the first one through a parliamentary process to bring medical end-of-life legislation. But ultimately, Brendan, it's the criminal code that determines whether or not this is allowed. And so in Canada, it's the criminal code that determines that ultimately, and then the provinces in the way you administer healthcare deal with it. And so the federal government voted very recently to make it illegal to implement or offer conversion therapies. These are conversion. These are therapies that apply to someone who's understood to be homosexual and wants to convert to a heterosexual state. And these conversion policies were made illegal by the federal government, of course, using again the criminal code. That's the question. Is then, to answer your question, what's the entry point in terms of jurisdiction? And it would be the criminal code on these moral issues that would be the key. In the States, it's the states. Here, it's the federal government. On identity, very key. I mean, identity is a very big issue right now in the world. Identity politics has contaminated our politics everywhere. And to answer your question very directly, it is easier in a federal system to deal with identity issues when especially if it's geographically based, than it is in a centralized form of government, because you can give that specific group that you're thinking of powers over their own future that they may feel is key to preserving their language, their culture, or their identity. I want to give you one interesting example. When I was elected to the House of Commons, there were 10 provinces, and in the northern part, 2 territories. There was the Northwest Territory, and there was the Yukon, and the Yukon in the west, and the NWT. Well, our government passed legislation to create a new territory on the eastern side called Nunavut. This is in 1999. What did we do, in fact? We created a territory in which 90% of the inhabitants are Inuit, what we used to call Eskimo, giving them a de facto legislative base and existence as a specific identity and specific group. And we didn't legislate and qualify it in ethnic terms or even linguistic terms. We just created the territory, knowing full well that within that geographic space, 90% of the inhabitants are Inuit, and thus enabling us and enabling them in terms of having a legislative base, not the same as the provinces, to work from. So here in Canada, the French language culture is a constant debate. There's been language issues on bilingualism, the use of French. What is a federal jurisdiction usually operates both in French and in English, but the future of the French population language is always at play. More recently in Canada, on the issue of identity, has appeared the very real substantive issue of our First Nations or Native communities, which represent a small percentage of the population, but nonetheless have a very significant role. I mean, they were the occupants of this land before the French or the British ever appeared. We created an apartheid system in Canada of reserves, you know, for that still stands to this day, because we haven't found an acceptable alternative. And it doesn't have the same, obviously, goals that it may have had elsewhere in the world, but it is nonetheless definitely a system of reserves where Native people are treated differently. And this, from an identity point of view, has become a very important issue. Now, federalism in general does allow us to address specific. I'm thinking in your case, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. If there were to be a decentralization in the view of creating a federal system within the UK, not saying that's the case, obviously these identity issues would figure very prominently in any discussion about the distribution of powers and what is needed in terms of powers to maintain the identity of specific groups. On the DNA, as you mentioned, I'm glad that you noticed that, because it's key. You know, it's at the very outset, what happens here in very practical terms. The British at the time realized that if they're going to hold on to this part of British North America that they obtained through the Treaty of Versailles after the 100-Year War, there's 60,000 French-speaking inhabitants left by the French, that they're going to have to make compromises, because otherwise they will be tempted. And the Americans at the time, as they foment their revolution, are trying to attract this population to their cause and to make a common cause with them against the British Crown. And so the British Crown at this time, in its wisdom and in its interest, decided to make a compromise that is going to be foundational for Canada. For there on in the history of our country, there is the willingness and the ability and to recognize the specific needs and rights of one group for the purpose of building a country, and everything builds out from there. So it's an interesting, I think it's key, and it's a pivotal moment in what would then become Canada several hundred years later.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. If I could follow on from actually the first part of your answer, it's certainly the case in Canada, as in the United States and the UK, that you have you have a Supreme Court that can decide on constitutional issues. And in both the United States and the UK, there has been quite serious tension between the executive, to some extent the legislature on the one hand, and the judiciary on the other. And we saw in the last decade in this country, in the popular press, I mean, 3 judges on the front page of the Daily Mail being heralded as enemies of the people, which, as you will appreciate, is rhetoric from before 1945 in European terms. Is the role of the Supreme Court in Canada accepted by the overwhelming majority and broadly uncontroversial?
Our Supreme Court has a very different situation than the American Supreme Court, very different. The process of naming Supreme Court justices in the United States has become very political. As you know, they have to audition before congressional committees and are grilled on a whole host of issues relative to what their opinions are, what their past decisions were. You know, in the case of Roe versus Wade, for example, what has been very irritating to some is that there are 3 justices that were named under the Trump administration who were asked specifically about Roe versus Wade on their congressional hearing, and all 3 of them said that they would not overturn Roe versus Wade, but they ended up writing decisions or participating in the majority decision that did. And so it has become, and in the United States, the fight against abortion has become a battle to control the Supreme Court of the United States. And so Trump takes some credit for saying, well, I named these people who eventually gave us what we wanted. And so in Canada, that is not the case now. But Canada does have the bad habit of mimicking Americans because their influence is so bad. And we do have that we up until very recently, there was no process to vet candidates for the Supreme Court of Canada. A committee could be formed. Now there is a committee that's formed, advises the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has the ability to name. And by the way, one of the big differences between the British parliamentary system and the American Republican system is the concentration of power in the hands of the executive in the British parliamentary system, in the Prime Minister's office in particular. And in the last few years, there have been common complaints in all British parliamentary systems, including in Canada and the provinces and the federal, of more and more concentration of power within the center. And so in the American system, it is not the case. It's much more distributed. So in Canada, we have, up until now, we've avoided that dynamic, but I'm not sure we're going to resist. I think the Conservative movement in Canada, which is well positioned to win the next federal campaign, I suspect that they may want to go down that road. And if they do, they're going to politicize the court. And we'll do it at our detriment. Now, what we do have is federal legislation. Interestingly enough, Brendan, we're back to 1774. Our federal legislation says there's 9 justices on the court, and the law says 3 of them must be from a civil law jurisdiction. Remember, in 1774, what does the British government do? They recognize the Catholic religion, which is synonymous to French language. They say, we're going to exempt you from the oath of loyalty to the crown, and we're going to recognize French civil law as opposed to common law. And what does law do if not codify value? And it's been that way ever since. So now the legislation that constitutes the Supreme Court of Canada says that 3 of the justices that sit on the court essentially have to be from the bar of Quebec, and the 6 others from the rest of the country. And there is a geographic distribution. It's understood that there is a justice that comes from Atlantic Canada, from Ontario, there's 1 or 2, and then from Western Canada. So we have, and that is absent in the American system. I don't know of any geographic distribution within the American Supreme Court of saying, well, we need someone from the West, we need someone from the East. Actually, they're more on identity, as we are. And we are, of course, naming people from minorities, for example, women. And so that's been an issue on the composition of our courts. Judge-made laws is an issue here. We have in our Charter of Rights a notwithstanding clause. That was the deal made between conservatives and liberals when the Canadian Charter of Rights was voted in. The conservative provincial government said, we will agree to it at one condition: there has to be a notwithstanding clause that ultimately protects the sovereignty of our parliaments if there's a basic disagreement about the application of certain rights. And this is a more recent debate in Canada about because we've had governments who have started proactively using the notwithstanding clause as a standard practice as they vote legislation in, as opposed to using it as an exception. So that's one of the differences. But is there, I want to answer your broader question, is there concern about judge-made laws in this country? Yes. Yes, there is. But there is, contrary to the United States, a much broader distance between the legislative and the judicial branch, and hopefully that will remain the case.
For that, Michael Elmer, please.
I'd like to ask about language questions, but before that, if I may, a factual point that I probably ought to know, but I don't. Because the historical evolution of Newfoundland or Newfoundland, I'm not sure which is the current pronunciation in Canada, was different. Does it retain privileges which are not available to other provincial governments, because it did once have this separate independent existence? But on the language questions, apart from knowing Canadians from Ottawa, Quebec, and Toronto, which most people do, most of my Canadian friends are from the 2 geographical extremes. And from the West Coast, I hear a lot of complaint about what is seen as the excessive use of French, where you go a long way to find anybody who knows any French at all. And from the Atlantic coast, from the Maritimes, complaint about the failure of the governments there to protect Celtic languages, particularly Scots Gaelic, in places like Cape Breton Island, where I believe there's some danger of it dying out. And finally, you talked about the languages. Where there's a fairly big group like the Cree, is it possible to do any of the normal kind of administrative things in that language? Could a Cree, for example, produce a tax return in Cree?
Well, there's a lot in there. Let me start by returning to what are the basic language. Canada has 2 official languages. There are languages, and then there are the official languages in which the government operates and in which we expect businesses to operate. And the 2 official languages of Canada are French and English. Now, how is that applied by the federal and provincial government? Well, in the case of the federal government, in areas of its jurisdiction, let's say airports, ports, they are expected, and if you walk into an airport in Canada, no matter where it is, the signage will be in French and English, because the Official Languages Act that the federal government has adopted, this was Trudeau father's work, says that if you're under federal jurisdiction, you have to operate in both official languages and thus communicate. Thus the frustration I think you're probably referring to of people in Western Canada, where the French community is very small. Let's say, well, why do we have to have languages, signs in French or in English? Well, it speaks to the historic fact that this country was founded by French and the English. In fact, you'll find that French Canadians, Quebecois, will tell you the country was actually founded by Francophones, natives being here first. And then the Brits came in, and you just conveniently forgot that we had founded the country. And now our language and culture is threatened. And by the way, the French language and culture is under constant pressure. I mean, here we are, there's 8 million people in Quebec, and there's 80% of the population is French. It's not difficult to imagine that with all our American neighbors loudspeaker and the rest of the world on English language, that we are in a constant battle of survival to preserve and protect this French language and culture. And we do it quite well, by the way. It's, you look at the arts, culture, it is fascinating. It is truly an extraordinary accomplishment, but there's always this threat on the language that is omnipresent. But you can easily imagine in certain parts of the country, if there are recent people who've come here recently, they wonder, well, why is it that we would have to bother with French when in fact, now the other languages, Celtic languages in Cape Breton or elsewhere are not official languages, and they may be spoken, but then it's very much more of a provincial jurisdiction to determine whether or not they want to support in a material way the preservation and protection of that language through schools, through offering programs to teach, to maintain. Canada has in its constitution the recognition of a word that's a dirty word in a lot of jurisdictions, of multiculturalism. And it was all very well intended when it was introduced. And we have a law on multiculturalism. The idea behind multiculturalism is to celebrate the fact that we have in our country individuals who come from different cultures, different spaces, and that we value that, and that we celebrate the fact that there is diversity. But the question is can there still be one single identity in that kind of and I think I'm back to your question, Brendan. The answer is yes. Can you be a Quebecer, speak French, and a Canadian? The separatists say you can't be a Quebecer and a Canadian. I face that all my time. But when you get up in the morning, you don't feel like a piece of sausage where part of you is French, part of you is Canadian, part of you is Irish, part of you, look at my case, part of me is Irish, part of me is French Canadian, part of me is Francophone, part of me is a Quebecer, part of me is, we live in a world of multiple identities, and we should be able to celebrate that without having to choose between one or the other. So on language, these languages you're referring to are not official languages and don't have an official standing. On Cree, I'm assuming that you're talking to the Cree people. Well, the Cree and preserving native languages is a very big challenge. There's several native languages in Canada. The Naskapi have their language, the Cree, the Inuit speak Inuktitut. It is a very real challenge for us to do whatever we can to help preserve those languages and even enhance them, and avoid policies that would neglect us maintaining them, and not let this patrimony by the way of culture disappear under the pressure, the uniforming pressure of the English language everywhere. That's a bigger issue for the world, of whether or not we want to preserve the richness and the culture of these different cultures. But two official languages, that's what you need to keep in mind. Newfoundland, Labrador were caught in 1949 after a failed referendum to come in, and then a new one. And it is a fascinating part of the country. That's part of also the story of Great Britain having this colony that cost a lot, and by agreement saying you should really tie your future into Canada. And it's a very beautiful, but also a very rich part of the country. It's called Newfoundland Labrador, if you want to pronounce it correctly, because part of the land of Newfoundland, there's the island of Newfoundland, and on the mainland, there's a piece of what used to be a part of Quebec called Labrador. So that is also part of what they are. Do they have specific recognition of certain things? None come to mind, but I'll give you an example of a asymmetrical deal. When Prince Edward Island, the smallest of our provinces, came in, there was a condition, and that was that the federal government maintain the ferry service between the mainland and the island of Prince Edward Island. And those are things that have been provinces that have had specific things recognized when they come in that are of asymmetrical nature, and just speak to the fact that they wanted to protect certain things that they had that they felt very strongly about.
Thank you. Are you able to overrun by 10 minutes?
I'm fine. My schedule is open.
Because I think we've got some online questions, but first of all, I'd just like to ask a brief technical follow-up to Michael Elmer's question, which is in the European Union, there's this issue of comitology and trying to get the legal effect of the many, many languages of the European Union having the same legal effect, which is a challenge because different languages say different things in different ways, as of course you appreciate, because it's different between French and English. Is there any scope for arbitraging this comitology within Canada, or is there pretty good equivalence of French and English interpretations of Canadian law?
Well, the federal government does all its laws in French and in English. The province of Quebec, but it's a constitutional obligation, does all its laws in French and English. This is something that I've dealt with both as a lawyer and a legislator all my life. It means that we are constantly into language debates and making sure that the French version or the English version is consistent with the other language. And so it's great mental exercise that apparently is a very preventive measure for dementia later on in your life, because your brain will be stretched to new heights as you figure out the language of one and the other. And of course, we have interpretation laws that guide the courts and how they interpret, but there has to be a consistency in the French and the English version. And if there is not, and that happens, it does happen that there are drafting mistakes done in good faith, well, then what happens is that the courts are then have to try to dig deeper to determine what was the initial intent of the legislator, to determine whether which of the languages better reflects that intent. But you know, it brings me to a point about languages that's interesting that I've experienced in my lifetime. I speak both English and French. You know, a language is like a window on the world. And if you speak more than one language, the great advantage it brings in your lifetime is that if you look out a window to the backyard of your home, you'll see, you know, a certain number of things. If you move to another window, you'll see different things, yet it's the same backyard. The point I want to make, I hope I'm not being oversimplistic, is this. We have an opportunity with two languages to look at the world and better understand that world, to have a better understanding, a better comprehension. That's, if you look at language in that way, that's what gives us a richer, fuller life and a better comprehension. But not everyone sees it that way. They see it as a cumbersome. And now in the European Union, interestingly enough, all languages are equal, as you point out, but they're not really equal, are they? I mean, it's the English language. Even with the withdrawal of Great Britain, the dominant language of the European Union is English, sort of the common language. Even the French, you'll find periodically, are accused of overusing or using the English language too rapidly and too easily in their communications outside of France or even within France. And so, but the common language and the dominating language of communications within the European Union, as far as I know, is English. And it's obviously from English that you interpret most of the laws.
Can I just point out that English continues to be the official language in Cyprus, Malta, and Ireland, even though the United Kingdom has left the European Union. So it's not quite as anomalous as it might be.
And you know, in the United States, if you travel to the United States in the South, we do that a lot. It's very interesting to see how Spanish has crept up
Oh, yeah.
in their day-to-day, and in very practical ways. Signage in Spanish. We have a place in Florida. A lot of the signage is English and Spanish. And here in Quebec, we regulate signage. You can't have English signs visibly outside. And inside, we have a law that says if you have signage in English and French, the French has to be bigger letterhead than the English. Well, it works, you know, and mind you, in life and like in politics, compromises that may seem bizarre and unusual are better than no compromise at all. In the end of the day, life teaches us the hard way that it's better to have these compromises than no compromise at all.
Indeed. Ulrika, I think you've got some online questions, haven't you?
Yes, there have been a couple of questions from the online audience. Chris Hammond from East Kent for Europe has asked, are you a staunch supporter of federalism? Do Canadians like the system, or do any want a centralized state?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
There's a question possibly more addressed to Brendan. Asymmetrical federalism, would that be a possible system for the EU? And a question from Carl Wright, again to Monsieur Charest. You briefly mentioned local authorities. Would you agree that these, especially in big cities, represent a distinct third sphere of government?
On cities, is that the last, if I understood?
Yes. Local
Status.
authorities and cities.
Well, let me start with the first on support for. I am a very staunch supporter of Canadian federalism. I do believe that a federal system of government works well, and I'm a very big believer in the virtues of the flexibility of a federal system. And what I'm saying is that outside of the formal distribution of powers and responsibilities, there needs to be a space where you can accommodate change without having to go through the onerous task of amending a constitution and changing it, which can be very onerous. So you have to allow that. On other countries, Canada is very careful on dispensing advice or about what works for other countries, if only because we're very humble and have a lot of reasons to be humble in that regard. We've had our own debates on the future of our country and have not looked well upon those who come from outside to give us advice on what we should do for our own future. There's never any lack for that. But we do believe a federal system of government can work quite effectively. And we understand that it's, by the way, a taboo word or a dirty word in certain political circles. We get that, we understand that, and it's true in Great Britain, true in Europe. So it's interpreted as being negative in regards to, but a federal system, by virtue of what it does in the distribution of powers, does follow the logic, a pretty solid logic, and I believe can work fairly well. We are often, Canadians are time to time called upon in conflict zones where there are different ethnic and language and issues that are the source of conflict to share our federal experience. We've done that several times, but we've always done it very carefully, being sensitive to the fact that there are all sorts of other dynamics at play. Asymmetrical federalism, yes, could be very much an answer. And what is asymmetrical federalism if not recognizing differences and saying, no, a one-size-fit-all system doesn't work for everyone. And we shouldn't expect it to work for everyone. If there are differences, we should be able to accommodate them as long as they're done fairly and not with a view of it giving an advantage, which is often the perception, but it's and for the European Union, it certainly would make a lot of sense. Though the European Union is always, it seems we hear less and less about subsidiarity, the subsidiarité we say in French, which we always understood to be a very common sense principle of the application of the European Union. About cities, interesting debate right now in Canada. Cities in our constitutional framework are squarely under the responsibility of the provinces. They are, in the legal word that was chosen was, they are a creature of the provinces, a creation of the provinces. And now the federal government is always very tempted to go over the heads of the provinces and deal directly with the cities on issues like transport and transit and immigration or other things. And the provinces object. Here in Quebec, we've had a law on the books since the 1960s that says no city or any organization receiving money from the provincial government can accept money from the federal government. And that has allowed us to bring some coherence to the application of laws. Now, other provinces have not had that. The federal government recently has initiated policies where they want to deal with the cities directly. And some provinces now, when another province, Alberta to name it, is now tabled legislation to do what Quebec is doing, which I think is right, by the way. You know, it's there's a longer discussion to have on that. But if I, for example, if I'm Premier of Quebec and I'm dealing with healthcare, I allocate and arbitrate my resources in a budget annually. It is very irritating when the federal government helicopters in and says, well, here's money to do this or that. Well, you know what? I've just been through the whole process of allocating my resources, and all of a sudden you show up because a focus group tells you that knee operations are popular and undo everything I've done. You can see from an accountability point of view, the advantage is also important. If you're a taxpayer, you want to know who's responsible for what and who do you sanction if they're not doing their job. Now, if the federal government is mixing up all those lines, you're going to have difficulty getting that level of accountability. So in the case of cities, very relevant question right now. I guess I'll just finish by saying the difficulty is the importance that cities are occupying more and more in the governance of our respective countries, because we're asking them to do more and more things, and yet they don't have. And what are they arguing? What the cities are saying, give us the money. We want money to be able to do this. Well, and what are the provincial governments saying? They're saying, no, you know, we're not, we're going to give you limited ability to draw taxes or transfer money.
Well, thank you. That's been an absolute treat. I was thinking when you were talking about subsidiarity, we have virtually none in England. There is more in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but virtually none in England. But it's in Article 1 of the Treaty of European Union. It's there for anybody who wants to assert subsidiarity. So we've got it. And I hope it'll be the law of this country again sooner rather than later. But you've given us a very, very unique personal insight into a polity that I think is a lot better than the polity in this country at the moment, and something for which we could hope for the future. And Brendan, I think you're going to give the vote of thanks and have the last word. Perfection, Brendan.
Yes, that was really a great incentive. I have the last word, but I will use it to thank you very much indeed for a very illuminating tour d'horizon. It seemed to me that you've given us a rationale not merely of Canadian federalism, but of federalism more generally. And the 2 points I'd make, which stick in my mind as being morally and intellectually very attractive, is the point that federalism can combine both clarity and flexibility. I remember that I once looked up in a dictionary the definition of the word federalism. The first definition was a decentralized system of government. The second definition was a centralized form of government. And both are equally true, because the clarity of federalism is the allocation of responsibilities. And that's a good thing, it seems to me. But it is also, as you brought out, a system which allows for flexibility in the middle. Asymmetrical federalism in any federal system, particularly in the European Union, I think is all right up to a point. But I think you can't stretch it too far, because otherwise it ceases to be a federal system. That's just my thought. But from an almost moral and ethical point of view, what I found particularly attractive was the way in which you were talking about an equality of legitimacy between various levels of government.
Yeah.
And that is something that obviously you represent in your personal career. And I find it very attractive, but something that would be very difficult in this country to reproduce, because there is an obsession with the idea that Parliament is sovereign. And in a curious way, that's the difficulty that the British have with European federalism. because they can't believe that there's an equality of legitimacy between Europe and Westminster, in the same way that they can't believe there's an equality of legitimacy between Oxford or any other big city, or Scotland and Westminster. And perhaps our DNA doesn't allow us to see the things in those terms. It's so much the worse for us, I'm afraid I would say. But we, the people who believe there is a better system, a federalist system, if you like, one that's based more on consensus and compromise and clarity, must continue making our case. And thank you very much for giving us both the factual and the intellectual arguments to continue making it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Brendan and Dirk, and thank you. And I hope there'll be an opportunity for us to meet in person. And if ever you need, we do accept refugees in Canada from all over the world.
we might end up in Rwanda.
Yes. So thank you very much.
Okay,
Good luck.
thank you very much. Bye bye.
Been a pleasure. Bye bye.